Hi, everyone. Let's go ahead and get started. I see some people are still joining, but I'm going to start with my welcome. So hello and welcome to our panel on the US election, co-organized by the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions and the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs, the UBC Political Science Department, and the Canadian International Council, Vancouver chapter. My name is Paige Rumolt. I am a graduate student in the Master of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the SPPGA, and I am also this year's president of the MPPGA Students Association. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people on which Vancouver residents live, work, and study. A quick few housekeeping notes for our session today. You will also see these in the chat. Please note that we are recording this session and we will be posting the video on our website. We are also leaving the chat open and activity in the chat will not be recorded. Please direct your questions to our Q&A moderator, Tatiana Parrish, who will either call on you to unmute yourself and state your question, or she can state it on your behalf, depending on what you would like to do. Please be mindful and respectful during the session and in the chat. So I would like to now introduce our moderator. Today's moderator is the Acting Director for the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at UBC, Dr. Gerald Baier. Dr. Baier is an Associate Professor of Political Science whose teaching and research interests are in Canadian politics with a focus on the Constitution, federalism, and public law. He is a regular commentator on federal politics in national and local media and a recovering BC election analyst.
Thank you, Paige, for the introduction, and welcome everyone to this, the third in our series on the US election. I'm really thrilled to be taking the reins for this session. And perhaps the election will be finally done before we finish with our series next week, although I did notice 2 more states called this morning. So it looks like essentially all the map is filled in and things are progressing. Today's session is intended to focus on the global impact of the US election. Perhaps the US is unique, maybe not, but pretty close in the amount of global attention that its election receives. But of course, this has been an exceptional year. Given the general approach of the Trump administration that it's taken to the rest of the world, including institutions of collective security, trade, and cooperation. So a lot of eyes on the US for that very reason. Trump's apparent indulgence of more autocratic leaders has also drawn scorn over the years. But as we've seen over the last week, including from Canada and elsewhere, world leaders have started to recognize Joe Biden as president-elect, despite President Trump's own refusal to concede. We're also seeing developments along the lines of some Republicans starting to advocate for the president-elect to start receiving intelligence briefings. But we've also seen shakeups in the Defense Department and we're all trying to figure out what that means about President Trump's intentions during his last weeks in office. So it's a really opportune time to focus on, I think, that part of the outcome from the US election. And again, I was reminded this morning that the Secretary of State, the United States Trade Representative, and the White House Press Secretary all continue to talk about a second Trump administration as though it was a fait accompli. So we have lots to discuss. This session's format will see some initial reactions or comments from each of our 3 panelists, and then will be followed by 30 minutes of Q&A from me. And then we should have about 30 minutes left for Q&A from our audience. So we will call on you at that point. A reminder to send those questions to Tatiana. I think her screen name might actually be CIC Communications. If you're having a hard time, if you want to send a private question to her, that's also the name to look for. So let me introduce very quickly our 3 distinguished and wonderful speakers. Kathryn Harrison is here. She is a professor of political science at the University of British Columbia, and her primary areas of interest are environmental policy, federalism, and comparative public policy. Dr. Harrison has authored or co-authored books on these subjects and has distinguished record of journal publications. She is frequently called on to advise local, provincial, and national governments on climate change and environmental policy. And personally, I can attest that she's also a kind, generous, and most of all, a fun colleague to have. So welcome, Kathy. Hugh Gusterson is a professor in the Department of Anthropology at UBC. His work focuses on nuclear culture, international security, and the anthropology of science. And his research interests also include militarism, neoliberalism, counterinsurgency, and securitization. Dr. Gusterson's articles have been featured in various magazines and newspapers, and he has a regular column in the anthropology journal Sapiens. Welcome, Hugh. And Christopher Sands is with us as well. He is a senior research professor and director of the Center for Canadian Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He's also concurrently director of the Kennedy Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. So he's coming to us from the belly of the beast. Dr. Sands has a decade of teaching experience and over 2 decades of experience at Washington think tanks. His most recent book is on Canada-U.S. relations, and he is currently working on a book on the evolution of the North American political economy. Welcome, Professor Sands. So to get us started, I was just going to ask each of you a sort of broad question. We'll start with Hugh, as perhaps maybe the broadest reactions. Perhaps you could start us off, Hugh, by kind of giving us an idea of the kinds of trends or themes you'll expect to see from Biden's foreign policy. Ask you to just leave Canada-U.S. relations a little bit to Christopher and any details of environmental policy to Kathy. But can you give us a general impression? What will be the first few things that Biden will do to try to signal changes in the U.S. administration's attitude toward the rest of the world?
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me onto this panel. I'm very honored to be with such distinguished colleagues and to have an opportunity to share some thoughts. So let me begin before I say what changes we might anticipate with 3 caveats. So the first caveat is that I think President Biden's first priority will be and has to be dealing with the pandemic rather than foreign policy. And there are some urgent foreign policy issues he'll have to address immediately, but inevitably I think foreign policy will be somewhat on the back burner. The second caveat I would make is in terms of prognostication. Foreign policy is often made in reaction to unexpected events. One thinks of the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan after 9/11, which no one predicted when they elected George W. Bush. So there might be something that we just can't foresee that will completely reshape Biden presidency's foreign policy. And then the third caveat I would make is that if the Republicans retain control of the Senate, which looks more likely than not, then President Biden will have heavily circumscribed room for maneuver. There'll be all sorts of things that he can't do in terms of signing treaties and so on that he might want to do. So let me make a general characterization of sort of the overall tenor of a Biden foreign policy that I would anticipate. And then I want to say something about 2 particular areas. One is my own area of interest, which is nuclear arms control. And I'll say something about Brexit too, maybe because I'm originally British, so it piques my interest. So in terms of a general characterization, the single word that comes to mind for the kind of foreign policy we should anticipate from Biden would be restoration of Obama's foreign policy and the personnel that managed Obama's foreign policy. David Sanger, the New York Times columnist I noticed, predicted a great undoing of much of what Trump had done by executive order and by fiat. And I think that's true. And I noticed that the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, immediately tweeted, "Welcome back, America," after the election. So this anticipation, both in Washington, D.C. and among America's allies, I think, that American foreign policy will look something like how it did between 2008 and 16. If personnel is policy, as people widely say in Washington, I think we can expect to see a lot of familiar names from the Obama-Biden presidency returning to power. People like Tom Danelon, who was the National Security Advisor, Susan Rice, who was the UN ambassador. There are rumors that Biden might want her to be Secretary of State, though I don't think a Republican Senate would confirm her. And Antony Blinken, who was the Deputy Secretary of State under Obama. And these people will bring with them a return to multilateralism, a support for international institutions, for which Trump has shown disrespect, more emphasis, certainly at the rhetorical level, on human rights and on the importance of an international community of democracies. It seems pretty clear that maybe on his first day even, Biden will rejoin the Paris Accords around climate change, and he will recommit to the WHO. The US hasn't formally withdrawn yet, but Trump has announced that he's not cooperating with it and wants to withdraw. So the US can be expected to recommit to the WHO. You'll see a reaffirmation of the importance of NATO. which will signal, hopefully, the failure of Vladimir Putin's strategy of trying to divide NATO and make it implode in upon itself. We can also expect, I think, an end to the Muslim ban, or most of the Muslim ban. A few countries may stay on the banned list, but most will not. And a resumption of the issuance of H-1 visas for people from India and other countries in the global south with technical skills that the US wants. Big unknown, I'm not going to predict this, is what will happen at the Mexico border. I'm sure the wall will be discontinued, but how much the change in terms of processing people applying for asylum, how much of a change there'll be there, I'm not sure. So I said I'd say something about arms control. Let me briefly talk about that. When President Trump came to power, there were two major arms control treaties with Russia. He managed to kill one of them, that's the INF Treaty. So there's only one left, and that's the New START Treaty, which limits each side's strategic nuclear weapons to 1,550. That treaty is scheduled to expire 16 days after the inauguration. President Trump has sort of fitfully attempted to renegotiate it, hasn't really shown that much interest in keeping it alive. So at the moment, it's on a glide path to dissolution. From what I understand, President Biden is more or less guaranteed, as long as Vladimir Putin will go along, to renew the treaty. And it's a provision of the treaty that it can be automatically renewed for 5 years. Putin did make that offer to Trump, which Trump has so far ignored. And so we can expect that, that Biden will renew the treaty. An interesting question is whether he will continue a policy started under the Trump administration of trying to bring in tactical nuclear weapons, which are currently unregulated, and trying to draw China into a new START. And I think it's quite likely that he will. The other major arms control treaty that Trump inherited was the JCPOA, also known as the Iran nuclear deal. The deal to relax sanctions on Iran and give it access to the international community in response for limiting its enrichment of uranium and constraining its nuclear program. President Trump withdrew from that treaty. Biden has made it pretty clear that he stands by the treaty and that he would like to rejoin the treaty. He will not be deterred by the opposition of Israel. A lot of bad blood between Biden and Netanyahu. And I think Biden supports Obama's policy of pushing to one side Israel's objections and making a treaty to restrain Iran's nuclear program a matter of vital national security importance to the US. The complication here is that since Trump withdrew from the treaty, Iran has felt free not to be constrained by it. So Iran has busted out of its limits on enrichment of uranium and so on. So in order to restore the treaty, Iran has to agree to come back into compliance with it. And so we're partly talking about predictions of what will happen in Iranian politics. There may be a new president in Iran and so on. Interesting other questions around arms control. Will the Biden presidency try and push to ratify the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which the US signed in 1996? Probably not, because you'd need cooperation in the Senate. Trump will leave Biden a $1.2 trillion plan to modernize the US nuclear stockpile. That's an enormous economic burden in the context of the pandemic. So there's a question whether the Biden presidency will cut that modernization program or slow it down. Will it try and cut nuclear weapons more? Might it move to a pledge not to be the first to use nuclear weapons, to use nuclear weapons only for deterrence, not in a first strike situation? Every US administration has always refused to make that pledge, but Biden has sometimes in his speeches indicated that he would be sympathetic to such a pledge. And I want to say one more thing about the arms control situation. Biden comes into a very difficult environment politically. So although this hasn't received much notice in the Western media, there is a treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, a treaty that makes nuclear weapons illegal under international law. And it just entered into force last month. Enough countries have ratified it that it is now technically international law. So any country that owns nuclear weapons is out of compliance with international law. And countries from the global south are increasingly angry and annoyed that the established nuclear powers haven't been cutting their nuclear arsenals rapidly enough. And as the countries from the south see it, they're not really in compliance with their commitment under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to abolish nuclear weapons eventually. So there's great pressure from the international community to move forward on arms control with deep cuts. On the other hand, Biden is looking at a Republican Senate dominated by Republicans who are probably the most hawkish that they've been in several decades. So he has to navigate that environment. Just very briefly in concluding, something about Brexit. Bad blood between Biden and Boris Johnson. Biden once referred to Boris Johnson as Trump's clone. Boris Johnson has been counting on a preferential trade deal with the US to sweeten the bitter pill of Brexit for the British people. And Boris Johnson has been threatening to break the Good Friday Accords and to redivide Ireland between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland in order to gain leverage in his exit negotiations with the European Union. Biden has been absolutely clear more than once that he will oppose any attempt to break the Good Friday Accords and to redivide Ireland. So this could cause some major complications for Boris Johnson in his attempt to get a good Brexit deal out of the EU. And it could mean a downgrading of the special relationship between the US and the United Kingdom, with Washington negotiating more directly with Paris and Berlin and cutting London out of the communications sometimes. Thank you.
Thank you, Hugh. So we can go from one special relationship to another and talk to Christopher. And Christopher, our audience might be obviously especially interested in what a Biden presidency means for Canada, and you're our expert on that. So apart from climate or pipeline issues, which we'll ask Professor Harrison to talk about, obviously, what does a Biden presidency mean for Canada? And if you'd like to comment further, what kinds of multilateral institutions that Canada has particularly been involved in or seen as central to its foreign policy would you see, I think as Hugh predicted, kind of come to the fore in this new Canada-US era?
Thank you very much. I'm going to pick up on Hugh's comments about caveats. I think he's exactly right that there are certain things we just have to wait and see how they happen, and you never know about the unexpected. So I'll just put that out there. But the pandemic is a huge priority, and I think this is my view. We've been struggling with this for a while, and there aren't really very many good examples of countries that have done really well. Everyone struggled. Second waves come, and I think that's one of the priorities for this administration is to show they can do better than President Trump did, and it's going to be preoccupying. I'll add to that. So the U.S. is going through a transition that isn't finished yet, and I think that's the backdrop to a lot of what you'll see in the Biden administration. Transition behind the scenes between a United States where the largest block of the electorate were the baby boomers, which gave us great stability in party identities over a longer period of time, and the rise of the millennial generation, which is the largest block in the electorate now. Even though the millennials are our most important voting bloc, as you probably saw, we have a very elderly set of candidates that we are running everything from Congress to the White House. And a friend of mine unkindly likes to say that the United States these days looks like the last days of the Soviet Union, a bunch of geriatric leaders and no toilet paper, but we're doing our best to recover. But I think as a result of this shift, which is tectonic below the surface of our politics, the parties who are a little less ideologically tethered than the parties you would see in Canada or Britain or other countries, they're just big tent parties, they tend to shift to find their new coalitions. And one of the lasting legacies of Donald Trump is his response to an argument that's been around since the Clinton days, Bill Clinton's presidency, that the United States is going to become a majority-minority country, where the majority of the voters identify with a minority of some sort, either a minority of ethnic or racial background, or a minority that is related to sexual preference. And so these kinds of issues are very difficult for the Republicans because they had this reputation of being sort of New England blue blazer country club folks, and there's just no future for them in that kind of America. And Republicans have dealt with this following all of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of dying, with denial, with anger. We've seen it all played out. What Donald Trump did in 2015 and 2016 in the run-up to the election was he identified the weakness of this party that had lost its sense of purpose and direction, and he offered them a very different style, and that was to make the Republican Party a blue-collar workers' party. His judgment was that the Democrats had largely abandoned union voters and who are more socially conservative in pursuit of some of these other identity-based politics, and he thought he could win them back. And what we saw in this last election was, strikingly, that there were significant inroads into Hispanic and African American, also Asian communities as well. And so even though he's likely lost, Donald Trump has changed the party, in part by giving it this new base that will make it less interested in being a deficit hawk, perhaps more interested in maintaining not only defense spending, but also social spending. There are a lot of implications that the party hasn't quite come to terms with. But there's a factor that's worth underscoring. Donald Trump's hostile takeover of the Republican Party drove a number of the party's most talented members and most traditional members away, the famous never-Trumpers. And some of them will now find a home in the Democratic Party because the Democratic Party has become the party of Wall Street and the big tech firms as well. And this is where many of them will be comfortable. And this will be part of Biden's challenge, which is assimilating those new voices into his coalition, which has shifted as well. So that's a beginning, but I have to say, the change in American politics only gets worse. He was right to point out that the Congress is deadlocked, which is going to make it very difficult to pursue any sort of broader legislative agenda without some element of bipartisanship. I do think, despite all of the polarization, there is a growing and maybe even significant now area for bipartisan consensus on a number of issues that matter to Canada that we'll talk about in a bit. But nonetheless, the hostility, the bad blood, the way this election has been challenged will definitely linger. And you can expect a Biden administration, therefore, to be very domestically preoccupied, at least for the first year or so. And then gradually in the second 2 years after the 2022 midterms, start to focus a bit more on foreign policy. Typical of many presidencies, when they become frustrated domestically, the president has more latitude in foreign policy. So I expect a bit more foreign policy starting after 2022, when midterm elections are likely to take the narrow majorities and make them bigger. And I suspect if history is a guide, we'll see Republicans do well in both and widen their advantage in the Senate and perhaps take over the House in 2022. So as Biden tries to deal with this, he's got a number of disadvantages. And I'll just name a couple. One relates to the party shift that's going on. Joe Biden is someone we've known for 50 years or more at the national scene. He is a traditional centrist Democrat. Been around a long time, especially on foreign policy. We know a lot about what he thinks because he spent a considerable amount of his time in the Senate on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And so he's one of the best traveled presidents that we've had. He's quite well known around the world, and I think this is to his credit. But he is not part of the Democratic Party's energy, which is much more on the environmentalist side, Black Lives Matter, some of the groups that have really been itching for change. And many of them heard everything they wanted to hear from Barack Obama, but felt at the end of his 2 terms that not a lot was accomplished, and they were impatient for change. Because Joe Biden is not expected to run for re-election, given his age at a minimum, everyone wants that change to be delivered on now. And so in this sense, I think actually the best news for Biden is that he can blame the Republicans in the Senate for not doing everything that his base wants. But because he's not expected to run again, from the very first, these factions will be looking to try to position themselves as the kingmakers for the selection of who comes next. And I think you can expect to see Kamala Harris being very much out there, typical of recent vice presidents, taking major files and carrying them forward for the administration in order to both give her greater name recognition, but also some credit for some substantial successes in this 4 years, so that if she chooses to run as Biden's successor, she'll have a leg up and not just look like the end of a tired administration, but somebody who actually did more on the national scene and is identified with policies. So The other problem that Joe Biden has is Donald Trump. And I don't mean to depress everyone. Every time I make this remark, I get lots of comments in the chat about how sad everyone is, but he's not going to go anywhere. And I can't get in his head. But you can see from the remarks he's made since the election, during the last 4 years, he believes that Barack Obama and his administration deliberately tried to sabotage his administration with false accusations, with phony intelligence claims, with the Mueller investigation, etc. Outside the United States, many of these things were simply taken as writ. They were all true because the FBI said or intelligence groups said. But at the end of the day, Donald Trump, nothing was proven about him, and he believes that this was an attempt to ruin his administration, and he nonetheless got a lot done. But now, if he's lost this election, I think he's going to make it his business to make the differences between Biden and his base and the splinters within the Democratic Party as wide as possible. And he will make it almost impossible for Biden to govern. On every issue, he will be a very loud voice of opposition, much louder than Mitch McConnell in the Senate. And the uncertainty that Canadians have dealt with in the United States will only grow. I think Hugh made the good point that things like the Paris Treaty and other things, the sort of return of old ideas will definitely be on the Biden agenda, but every step will be costly for him to take. And it may be difficult for him to follow through on because Trump will be a source of nonstop harassment of his government from the outside. Adding to that, I guess I would just say this about the Canada-US agenda. The best news I have for you is that the USMCA is completed. The CUSMA agreement is done. It was widely approved. It is one of the things that got more bipartisan support really than almost anything that was passed other than COVID relief in the last Congress. It is it's a sign, I think, of a real shift in U.S. trade policy that Biden is unlikely to break with. But the real key here is that Donald Trump negotiated the USMCA under a 2015 grant of trade promotion authority to the Obama administration that still had some years in it. He got one extension, which was allowed for in the statute, to 2021, and then it will expire. So there's maybe time for the Biden administration to take the U.S. back into the TPP because that's already negotiated. Shouldn't take too long. But after 6 months, the authorization will expire, and I think it'll be very difficult for a Biden administration to get additional trade promotion authority. Not impossible, but very difficult. So things like WTO reform, other things that we've been looking to are unlikely to take shape early. Climate change might be the one thing that could go well, but rather than simply rejoining Paris, I think I would focus on the Glasgow COP meeting, which was supposed to be next month, but actually has now been postponed until next year, as an opportunity to make a new deal on climate. This is not my area, so I'm going to let Kathryn talk about it, but climate may be something that comes up. But for almost everything else in the Canada-US agenda, I think the uncertainty and the chaos in Washington will mean that Canada's on its own. And we'll have to do many of the things bilaterally. You'll just have to solve problems without congressional legislation and a minimum amount of presidential time. But if there's a silver lining in that, it's that I think the president and the prime minister serve as the fire department for the Canada-US relationship. They don't really manage it day to day, but they come in to put out fires when they happen. And we haven't had access to that, at least since the 2018 G7 meeting, which really represented the break between Trump and Trudeau. Now we have a US president who does like Canada, who knows Justin Trudeau, and I think we'll have recourse to at least some attempt at damage control when things go wrong. But for 4 years, if Canada can keep its head down, its expectations low, we'll get along great.
Well, maybe you've answered the question of whether or not the first visit will be to Canada by the president. Hopefully that's kind of been a tradition, right? Okay, so switch to Kathy, and you were almost segued in right there with the indication that there's likely to be a change in climate change approach. But what are the challenges there, Kathy? What's going to happen? What does it mean for bilateral issues between Canada and the United States? And I'm sure Christopher would like to know whether or not Canadian pulp and paper can come to the rescue on the toilet paper shortage.
Canadian pulp and paper isn't what it once was. I'm not going to give any caveats. I just see the futures, clearly in front of me. Okay, so climate change, you know, the differences between Donald Trump and Joe Biden are night and day. The current president has rejected climate science. Actually, you know, he used to accept climate science, so I don't think he doesn't actually know what scientists say. I think he just doesn't care. And that has reinforced his predilection to undo environmental regulations. He has reversed all of his predecessors' climate actions and has either already relaxed or is rapidly rushing to finalize relaxing about 100 other environmental policies. Withdrew from the Paris Agreement. That took effect the day after the election. And Joe Biden accepts climate science and indeed has stated time and again that he sees climate change as an existential threat to humankind. So I'll say a few things at the global level. What can we expect the US to do? And then what are the implications of that and US domestic policy change on climate for Canada? So the obvious one is the US withdrew from the Paris Agreement and Biden has committed to return the US to Paris. You know, while the Trump administration was in the process of withdrawing, all of the other countries of the world sort of put on a brave face and said, we're committed to moving forward even without the US, you know, we've got this. But in fact, it is a big deal to have the US back. The US is the second largest emitter, you know, second to China, accounting for about 15% of global emissions. But I think even more important is just the size of the US economy and the threat that creates to other countries that are worried about the impacts of the US not acting on their industry's competitiveness. So the rules in the Paris Agreement would allow the US to rejoin with a month's notice. My understanding is that there's a requirement that the US would have to come in with a more ambitious NDC or national target, but there's some creative thinking going on among Biden advisors of ways, for instance, that the US could commit to a more ambitious longer term target, like net zero by 2050 with the details to follow. Realistically, the rest of the world wants the US back in that treaty, so I wouldn't expect them to get too picky, but rather to find a way to get the US in. And I think that's critical because, as Christopher said, COP26 that was supposed to be in Glasgow this year has been delayed to next year. That is the first time that countries are supposed to ratchet up their ambition. And it's very much a dance where they wait to see what each other's going to do. And I would be looking to see whether there's another US-China agreement that would lay a foundation or reassure other countries to ratchet up their agreements coming before COP in the fall of 2021. Beyond rejoining the Paris Agreement, Biden has promised to re-engage internationally in other ways, to call a meeting of large greenhouse gas polluters, to engage G20 countries, and he has raised the specter of the US employing border carbon adjustments that would basically penalize countries that don't match the ambition, which remains to be seen, of US climate policies. Similar measures are under discussion in the European Union. Legal scholars have said it can be done as long as it's done carefully. And that's, I think, a really interesting approach that has the promise to spill over ambition to other countries, because if your industry is going to pay to the US, you might as well regulate them at home and keep the money within your own country. So we'll see. I think the action is going to be about the Paris NDCs in the next year, and there isn't going to be a basis for any kind of border carbon adjustments till the US starts doing something again. So let's turn to Canada then. Canada's own climate policy has been pretty contradictory. On one hand, we commit to climate leadership. On the other hand, we don't have a plan to meet our target, and that's largely because we're committed to increasing our production of carbon-intensive oil for export. And the impact of the US increasing its climate actions therefore have contradictory impacts on Canada. So the oil industry is potentially quite vulnerable. Most obviously, Biden has said that he would again reject the Keystone XL pipeline. The Canadian industry is counting on 800,000 plus barrels per day of export through that pipeline. There's lots of talk of, the Alberta Premier calling on Justin Trudeau to convince Joe Biden of how great we are and how the US should want our oil. I'm very skeptical that would convince him, given he's taken a very clear and strong position with all the facts on the table going into the election that he's now the presumptively won. In the second presidential debate, Biden said the US needs to transition away from oil, and I'm sure a shudder went through Alberta at that point. He's talked about ratcheting up fuel economy standards. To the extent he does that, and he'll do something, and that will require that Canada matches it, that means that consumption of oil will decline in North America, and that's the market that we produced our oil for. There will be increasing pressure from the industry to get that TMX pipeline built so Canada can get its oil to other markets. Turning to the other side, the actual climate policy side of the equation as opposed to oil, the Biden platform was very ambitious, talked about $2 trillion in spending over 10 years, introducing net zero carbon budget legislation. It will be very hard to accomplish some of those things if the Senate is still controlled by Republicans, even if the Democrats win a narrow majority given the filibuster rule. So what can we expect to see? I think there will probably be more green spending in the budgets going forward, including any stimulus spending after the inauguration. Republicans and Democrats both like money flowing into their constituencies, and budget legislation is not subject to the filibuster rule. So look to see how much green spending gets built into that, particularly I would think for the auto industry to transition. But I think what we will see going forward is a Biden administration doing what Obama ended up doing in his second term, and that's relying on executive authority under existing legislation. And the greener elements of the Democratic Party will be looking to Biden there. It's not going to fly to say, well, the Republicans won't let us do it if he's acting on his own authority. And there may be room for support from the auto industry and the electricity sectors, both of which are either in the process or see the writing on the wall for transition. So first up, I think will likely be motor vehicle fuel economy, tailpipe emission standards. Trump withdrew California's waiver to set stricter fuel economy standards. I expect that would be a quick thing for Biden to reverse. Then the Biden administration had undone the second phase of Obama's tailpipe standards. Certainly, Biden will act to replace that, but my guess is that he'll want to replace it with something more ambitious than what was adopted 6 or 7 years ago. So the question is, how long will that take? Will they try for a national zero-emission vehicle mandate? There was talk about phasing out gas-powered engines in the platform, but no deadline in there. And all of this is tremendously important for Canada, both because of the significance of our auto manufacturing sector in Ontario, but also we are making cars for an integrated North American market, and we're the small player in that market. So historically, we've just adopted whatever the US was doing. Canada's been playing a waiting game there, but we're counting on emissions reductions for our own Paris target. There will be some action to replace the Clean Power Plan, the regulations for electricity generation that Trump rolled back. That one's going to be tricky for the Biden administration because already there were court challenges and big questions whether the creative approach that was taken in the Clean Power Plan would be supported by the Supreme Court. I think it's much less likely now that the current Supreme Court would support that very flexible interpretation. So big questions of what the Biden administration will do there. They have committed to transitioning the US to zero emission electricity by 2035. So high level of ambition. In theory, they have the tools to do it, but it will be costly without that flexibility. Close with a couple points of the implications of this for Canada. Greater US ambition makes climate policy easier for Canada. So we're one of those countries that's been putting on a brave face, but we've been one of the ones most worried because Canada always faces huge industry pressure that if we get out of line with our US trading partners, we will hurt our domestic industry. Those arguments, especially going into developing a post-2022 climate plan for Canada, won't carry as much weight as the Biden administration is moving forward. And in fact, depending how ambitious those executive actions are, they could be pushing Canada to do more. We're not immune from any future border carbon adjustments because of the ways we've subsidized the oil industry and the way we have subsidized industries to protect their competitiveness from carbon pricing. And we're not on track to meet our Paris Agreement target. So actually, in many ways, this could be a moment of truth for Canada in deciding how quickly and are we ready to transition away from our own very fossil fuel intensive economy as the US is moving ahead, has been making more progress than us, is potentially investing in clean tech, and is reducing the market for our fossil fuel exports. How long are we going to keep digging into the tar sands and heading towards that cliff as opposed to starting to turn away and transition our own economy?
Great, thanks, Kathy. So I'm gonna reverse the order. So I'm gonna ask you a follow-up first, and then the other two presenters before we turn to our Q&A with the audience. But I guess I was gonna use Keystone XL as maybe an example. I mean, this is one that's clearly got a statement from, I think, Biden, although I hear arguments that, oh, maybe he can like leave things in the courts for a while and not have to really push the issue. But what you said at the end about a sort of moment of truth, I think, is kind of where I was going. Is there a risk or a potential that changes south of the border kind of call Canada's bluff on having it both ways, right? In the sense that, you know, there's a two-level game. Trudeau can play, well, you know, Trump wants XL, so we'll let XL go because we can't do TMX. That, you know, that there is a sort of almost an empowering, as you say, requirement that Canada has an opportunity to put its money where its mouth is. So it's almost a strictly Canadian question, but, you know, is this change to the overall North American environment something that is likely to have a really strong ripple in Canada?
So I think the Trudeau government's support for expansion of oil and gas export while, you know, acting on Canada's own emissions has been reconciled by the government in a couple ways. One of them is, oh, we'll take any profits from Trans Mountain and use them to transition. But that's always been a kind of bogus argument. The main thing has really been, we're going to wait for the rest of the world to put our oil industry out of business. That's not our job. We're going to wait and see what the ambition of the rest of the world is. And this is that moment where both the US may take stronger actions to reduce its consumption of oil. And there are, to date, essentially our only export market, and we're exporting about 80% of the oil that we produce. So that's a really big deal. But also at a time when the US could, by stepping up in the Paris Agreement and potentially bilateral and other multilateral contexts, increase other countries' ambitions. So, you know, the scenario going forward is already looking bad for Canada's oil, and it could look a whole lot worse in over the next year. So If the Trudeau government was waiting for the rest of the world to put our oil industry out of business, we may start seeing that happen pretty quickly.
Thanks, Kathy. Christopher, I was going to ask you, you hinted at 2018 kind of being the break-off of prime ministerial presidential relations, and we often put a lot of emphasis on that. But liberal politicians, I think, over the last couple of years for sure, have emphasized, in regard to USMCA and so on, the strength of sort of a more traditional lobbying approach in the United States. So Canadian politicians working with governors, working with members of Congress and Senate. Do you expect to see that kind of the sort of infrastructure that was built there, kind of continue to drive that relationship, or are we back to a Mulroney, Reagan, Trudeau, Obama kind of bromance that can pave the way for a more congenial period?
That's a good question. I think actually the effort that was made to lobby the United States on USMCA was historic and really very impressive. Engagement with not only governors, but with data with governors and with members of the House and the Senate and Congress, really helping educate Americans as to how important Canada is. I mean, not our biggest trading partner now, a long time was, but with current data, not worrying about the past, just saying right now we create this many jobs, we have this much economic activity. And I've talked to a number of members of both the House and the Senate who had a sort of pleasant surprise to hear about this. I mean, we always say that people don't know enough about Canada, but when given information, they were pleasantly surprised. Wow, this is really important. And I think there's some goodwill that bought, and there's every opportunity to keep that going. The data is important, and I think that's something we need to emphasize. And the other thing that was good was it was not actually lobbying, because all parties, premiers as well as federal MPs, were on message to say, we're just more important than you may think, that's all. It wasn't, and so let our aluminum in and get rid of these national security tariffs and those sorts of instrumental issues. It was a goodwill building campaign. It was very successful. And I think there is potential for keeping that kind of dialogue going. And I would be particularly interested in seeing it. That one of your now former diplomats in the United States, Nadia Theodore, was your consul general in Atlanta. And one of the things that she said recently when she was leaving that position was that the change that's coming in the US is to a new and younger leadership, and they need to get to know Canada. A lot of what makes Canada-US relations work is the fact that our people, Canadians and Americans, like each other. It's a friendship between the peoples that the politicians try not to mess up or do mess up at their peril, but the people genuinely like each other. Now that's going to be attenuated for a couple of reasons. One, joint border restrictions to essential traffic only. We're not hanging out as much as we did, so that's one part of it. A second part of it is, and I have to say it, one of Canada's greatest strategic disasters in my entire lifetime occurred during the Harper years. And that was Stephen Harper's decision to eliminate, zero out funding for Canadian studies abroad, including in the United States. Now, I'm a professor. You might say, special pleading, he just wants his grants. That's what all profs want. I know, but bear me out here. The problem was that decision was made in 2011, and we're coming on 10 years in which Canada has not only been absent from curriculum in a lot of schools, but it's been absent from campus life. And when you had little Canadian studies programs at small schools like Western Washington, which still does maintain its program with some mostly US support, there were, Canadian Thanksgiving dinners and film festivals that included a Canadian film. Margaret Atwood might stop by to do a reading. And it wasn't really about Canada, but there was so much goodwill built. And the generation that's rising to take the lead in the United States, the millennial generation, many of them went to school and really didn't hear about Canada except on South Park. And that wasn't the best portrayal, all things considered. So I think there's a real challenge now, not only to keep up that campaign, but to bring it to a new, maybe a younger group. And as millennial leaders rise, and a few Gen X ones, there are some of them who are in government now, but a lot of them found politics so depressing during the Trump years that they've gone into business and NGOs instead. So meet them where they are. And in particular, I'll pick up on one of Nadia Theodore's comments, so she's saying that, not me. Canada has relied too long on East Coast and West Coast white guys as your establishment pals, some women too. Some of the people that are important are African Americans, Hispanics, and others, and there needs to be a real effort to engage those leaders. And I know people who went through the 60s and said, well, we really never had much to say about civil rights except that we're with you, because that was a very American debate. And I know some people feel the same way about Black Lives Matter, but it's really important for Canada to share its diversity, its multicultural society, its progressive ideals, so that people here understand Canada's not just a bunch of foreigners, but they're a bunch of foreigners who actually can relate to a lot of what's happening here and have some good ideas and can engage in a dialogue on it. So anyway, that would be my prescription.
As the guest speaker at the 2008 Yale Canadian Thanksgiving dinner, I appreciate the comment. I would just follow up just very quickly. Is that infrastructure? I mean, I'm surprised it took this long to realize the way that the American system works, and that it's not just about negotiating with the executive. But is that infrastructure sort of still there? Can you see evidence? And does Canada have a kind of comparative advantage at all in that? In that we have a deeper network of consulates and so on in the U.S. than probably a lot of other countries do?
Yes, you definitely have an advantage. There aren't very many negatives, associated with Canada, which is good. Mexico also does quite a bit of engagement at the state and local level, but they're dealing with a more negative issue set, or at least more dug-in feelings of hostility over whether it's drug trafficking or human trafficking. There are definitely some negatives there. Canada starts, I think, in that sense, in a better spot. But I think maybe the other side of it is that there was a time when Canada was kind of a unique partner, because we are isolated here in North America. We only have two immediately bordering neighbors. I guess you can count Alaska and Russia, but and maybe Denmark and Greenland. But generally, it's just the three of us here in North America, the Caribbean islands too, I guess. But Canada was really one of the countries that could easily engage with the U.S. And what's happened is, as U.S. politics have become more dysfunctional, the stakes in U.S. relations for all countries have become greater. And quite a number of countries now play middle power politics and try to be bridges in multilateral organizations, et cetera. And so I think Canada is playing catch up in terms of this engagement in domestic politics, and also faces a lot of competition, not necessarily enemies, but frenemies who actually have a slightly different agenda, or who want more credit to be leaders on things like climate change or peace with China, finding ways to insert themselves. So that's not to discourage you at all, just to say that it isn't there for the taking, it's there for the working. And I think you can do it, but you should bring your A game and not be dilatory about it, would be my advice.
Great, thanks. So Hugh, we're back to you finally. Thank you for your patience. So we hear a lot about how enemies of the United States appreciate the chaos of the Trump years. They like the uncertainty, and they really like the uncertainty of the present moment, with refusal to concede and shenanigans going on in Department of Defense. Do you have anything to say about, are we in especially dangerous 65 days ahead here? Or is there reason to be a little bit more hopeful? Are we right to be a little bit nervous about what's going to happen between now and January 20th?
Thanks for that question. Before I answer it, if I could just piggyback something on what Chris said about fellow feeling between Canadians and Americans. I recently moved to Canada from the US just in August. And I can't tell you how many of my friends emailed me and said, how did you do that? If I wanted to do that, how could I do that too? And maybe many of you have seen this meme that's been circulating on Facebook of the United States of Canada. And it pictures Canada with the top half of the US joining it in a new sort of liberal empire. So there's a certain kind of liberal American that has a strong sense of sympathy with Canada and fellow feeling with Canada, which I think the Trump years have only amplified. And Canada has come, maybe unrealistically and too idealistically, to represent what they wish the US was in terms of a healthcare system, more openness to immigrants and so on. So it's an interesting question. As under Biden, the US reverts to being more like what it was before. Will Canada's star dim? Or will there still be this sense that Canada represents something that liberal Americans might aspire to be? Okay, so to your question of what might we fear in the transition, one thing I've learned with Donald Trump is no matter what it is I fear, he manages to do something that I didn't anticipate. Who knows what he might do and what might happen in this lame duck period between now and the inauguration partly depends on what other countries do, right? Whether other countries behave with restraint or not. So one might imagine that some hawkish voices in China would be saying that with the turmoil in the Department of Defense, in the top leadership levels, maybe this would be a good time to grab an island in the South China Sea, right? And that the US would be in too much turmoil to do much about it. And especially if, as some people are predicting, the head of the CIA is pushed out this week, that would only increase the turmoil in the US national security state. In terms of what I read in the American press, so I won't predict anything, I'll just talk about scenarios I see other people worrying about. One theory for why Trump got rid of Secretary of Defense Esper is that Esper had opposed invoking the Insurrection Act to mobilize US troops against domestic unrest. So there is one concern, this is more of a domestic than a foreign policy concern, but one concern that if there were some kind of unrest, Trump might be planning to impose martial law, and that it might even be part of some plan to extend his presidency. Beyond that, in terms of other kinds of disruptions to the international order, if you like, the two things that I would point to, first of all, the possibility of withdrawing large numbers of American troops from places like Afghanistan, Iraq, maybe Syria, maybe Germany, maybe South Korea as well. Trump, for a long time, has talked about the US being overcommitted in terms of troop numbers to other parts of the world. It's part of his crusade against internationalism and multilateralism to want to bring back American troops from many foreign bases. And ironically, this is a point where his agenda converges with that of people on the left in the US. And so he's been frustrated. He's felt that the Pentagon has slow walked his demands here. They've blocked him by finding practical objections. Well, we could bring the troops back, but there's all that heavy artillery and stuff, and it would take a long time to get that on ships and to bring it back. So it is possible, according to some people, that he's imposed a new Secretary of Defense who would be willing to rapidly bring back troops. And it's hard to see how they might easily be put back where they were by Biden. The other thing that I might be concerned about, Trump clearly has an obsession with Iran's nuclear program and with bringing Iran to its knees in one way or another. I think he's also really been pushing for regime change in Iran, which is why he's intensified the sanctions so much and caused enormous suffering, I should say, for ordinary civilians in Iran. Anticipating a restoration of the JCPOA, it's not impossible that he might try and launch an airstrike against suspected Iranian nuclear facilities to make sure that they're destroyed for the foreseeable future. And who knows what that would do to a combustible Middle East. But that's another thing that I would be concerned about.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to do one last quick question that I'm going to address to all of you, and we'll just go through. I mean, as Christopher suggested, Trump is probably not going anywhere in the sense that he will be around in some form or other, and Trumpism, I guess, is the other side of it. A kind of sense of nationalism, some of the polarization of the parties that's been going on. So, for each of you, what do you think about the kind of, in the absence of Trump, the sort of hangover of Trumpism or the specter of Trumpism, how it will affect the various things that you had to talk about. So, Kathy, how will Trumpism sort of, maybe undermine some of the gains that you might see from Biden and so on. So we'll start with Kathy, then Christopher, and then Hugh again. So Kathy?
Oh, wait, unmute myself. There we go. The US is already an outlier internationally, with the possible exception of Poland, in terms of the level of denial of scientific consensus on climate change. And I think the longer Trump continues to push that, the longer that will last. And it's, it's a challenge, and it results in the Republic. It's contributed to the Republican Party being the anti-science party. On the other hand, he hasn't saved coal. Coal has continued to decline, in part because of abundance of cheap natural gas from fracking. I think we saw Biden's caution on fracking, and I think we'll continue to see that going forward. And the U.S. has also dramatically increased its production of oil from shale reserves, from fracking and shale reserves. Even if the Biden administration is committing to reducing U.S. consumption, it's still got this option to increasingly rely on the U.S.'s own production of oil while they do that. So, I think Trump continues to dumb down the debate about climate in the US, which was already pretty bad before Trump came along. But in practice, we're already starting to see greater transition in the fossil fuel sectors, various fossil fuel sectors in the US than we've had in Canada.
Thanks, Kathy. Christopher?
I think that there is likely to be some overhang of Trumpism, partly because I think he's reshaping the Republican Party as a nationalist populist party of the working class. And what we saw in this last election was that his base turned out for him, and he was able to expand on that base. And I think after 2016, many of us thought, well, there were a number of factors. Hillary Clinton didn't visit some states. There were mistakes made. And so maybe Trump is the accidental leader of the party, and that this will fade. But I think he's consolidated his hold on the party. That's the sort of first thing. The second thing, though, is that I think because the next 4 years are going to be it'll be very difficult to get anything done. And because I think Biden's success is in part because he really emphasized towards the end the importance of engaging with union voters, which have traditionally supported him. He distanced himself from some of the defund the police kind of rhetoric, which really was bad for Democrats in the suburbs, and a couple of other areas where the party might have been a little ahead of the mainstream. He too will be looking at the center. And a lot of what we'll see is a sort of an attempt to build a coalition by taking some of your old voters back. The advantage for Donald Trump is he doesn't have to do anything. He won't be in government. So all he has to do is criticize. And as everybody in opposition knows, that's always the easier side of things. And I think that because Joe Biden will be trying to operate under his browbeating tweets, it'll be challenging for Biden to do things that remind people of the Washington establishment. I admit I'm part of it, and nobody likes us. There is this broad sense, and I think Kathryn sort of put it the way that a lot of my neighbors would put it, which is, we've ignored the science, we haven't been paying attention to the international consensus. We're sort of the outlier, and Washington D.C. would be part of what Hugh was talking about, kind of joining Canada if it was possible. We could both be 51st states together, I guess. I don't know, but Washington D.C. is with you. But a lot of people in the country, even people who are not Trumpists, feel that the establishment in D.C. and New York and so on has been very cavalier not in what it's done, but who has paid for it. And I'm not supposed to talk too much about environment. Kathryn knows much more about it than me, but I'll just say that I think there's a degree to which policy is going to be looked through a lens of equity in ways that it hasn't before. So yes, we can move towards addressing climate change, but no, we can't be indifferent to union jobs and factory jobs put out. Like we can't simply say we're going to put the oil business out of business and we don't care about those workers. There will have to be simultaneously, here's what we're doing to help those people transition. This is how we're planning for the future for you. And I think that's the key to Biden being successful, but it's also the key to future politics. Just recognizing that we can't have good policy, but be indifferent to who's paying the price for it.
Great. Hugh, is Trumpism hanging over American foreign policy and for the future?
So I hear rumors that Donald Trump is planning in retirement to start his own TV show, or maybe even TV network or radio, maybe take over Rush Limbaugh's franchise. These are all different versions of the rumor. And combined with his Twitter following, that would give him a remarkable megaphone to keep his base riled up and to sustain the pipeline of untruths and fake news that keep them mobilized. But there are some questions whether Trumpism can be sustained, I think, into the future. I mean, one question is whether Trump will be prosecuted. I don't know that Biden's Justice Department would go after him, but it's widely rumored that the New York Attorney General has charges ready to file against him already. The federal government can't do anything about that. So Trump may be preoccupied with keeping himself out of prison in a legal case that would go on for a long time, or he may even end up being prosecuted. I think also the media landscape is about to change in a major way, and we're beginning to see this already. For 4 years, Trump has completely dominated the airspace of American public culture with his charismatic ability to speak at press conferences, with his Twitter account, and so on. In the last few days, since Biden became president-elect, we've seen him making regular appearances in front of the cameras. And so now that public airspace is being split. And you've got two different models of what a president looks like. And you've got two different sets of messages coming into play. So that might weaken Trump's hold on the public imagination. And, Trump is not exactly young. He had a close brush with COVID. Who knows how much longer he'll have the energy or be alive to create trouble. So one question I have is, can you have Trumpism without Trump? Is there someone who could take over the mantle of Trumpism? People who come to mind as having the charisma that he had to continue on would be his son, Donald Jr., maybe Tucker Carlson, the Fox News personality. And it's hard to think of too many other people, maybe Hannity, if he wanted to do it. But most Republican senators, like Ted Cruz and so on, they might support his policies, but they don't have the charisma to keep Trumpism going. So there is a question whether without Trump, it can keep going. But let's assume for the sake of argument that it does. You can expect Trump to make trouble for foreign policy in three regards: concerning treaties, tariffs, and bases, US deployments overseas. And so Biden would have to contend with pressure from Trump and his base not to sign treaties. And I don't think Biden's going to have much luck getting treaties ratified, to keep tariff walls up, and to bring troops home. Of the three of those, the one that I personally am sympathetic to is bringing more US troops home. And no one has talked about the overall budgetary environment, but I mean, the US is looking at a disastrous budgetary situation, only made worse by COVID. It has a defense budget of around $700 billion a year. And that's not including what it spends through the Department of Energy on nuclear weapons, what it spends on intelligence through over a dozen different intelligence agencies and so on. It's unclear whether that degree of spending is sustainable, whether the US liberal military empire can really sustain itself in this budgetary environment. So it's not just Trumpism. It may be that quite severe cuts will be enforced by budgetary factors too.
All right, thank you all three. So Tatiana, time to turn it over to you if you've got some questions from our audience.
Thanks, Jerry. We're moving on to questions I've received from the audience, and we're first going to start with Paige. Paige, do you want to hop in?
Sure. I'd like to begin by thanking all of our panelists for this fascinating and really engrossing conversation. As an American myself, born and raised in Washington, D.C., this is really top of mind for me. My question refers to some of the challenges that Chris has alluded to already. We've heard that President-elect Biden's mission is to unite and heal the nation. But I'm wondering, what are some of the challenges that you anticipate with the Democratic Party and moderate Republicans rallying support and consolidating support for the Biden administration? And what can they do in terms of messaging, and how will that look?
Can I start, Paige, in answering your question? I want to start by saying that you are definitely not one of the hated people of Washington, D.C. I know you may be in exile, but you would be one of the people we like. So here's the problem, and this is why I sort of open with the idea of transition. I think that because Vice President Biden ran on that sort of theme of restoration and a return to normal, he actually doesn't have a deep policy mandate. He has a stylistic mandate, an improvement of tone, but he's got a Congress so gridlocked that we have a recipe for continued difficulty. And I think it's going to be really hard for him to put sort of points on the board to actually have things. And when he does do something by executive order, I mean, this was sort of the President Obama's strategy after he lost Congress. He struggled and would do executive orders to get things done. And these were addressed as illegitimate. And then as soon as Trump came in, he went like the Tasmanian devil at all of those things, undoing them, scrambling them, issuing new executive orders, having those struck down by the court, coming back with even more. And so the thicket of rules and confusion is quite thick. Biden comes in as a sort of weak figure. This is maybe a way to think of it. President Trump was a disruptive president surrounded by a very weak party that couldn't constrain him. Joe Biden is a very weak president surrounded by a very disruptive party that wants change and change now. And I emphasize the millennials up front because I think they're the ones who will decide how this goes. And we'll have 4 years of probably depressing failure to achieve even minimal things, but some stability because of the gridlock. And by 2022, as I say, the Republicans will gain in the Congress. And the last 2 years of the Biden administration will be all about his succession. In fact, he will be discussed as almost past tense early on in his administration after inauguration, because he will not have that ability somebody who's going to run for re-election has to kind of discipline the party because he's their leader. And so I suspect it will be 2024 before we really know. And the question is how your generation really reacts to it. How do younger people react to it? I'll give you just some bad historical analogies. They could end up like the lost generation after World War I and the Spanish flu pandemic, coming out of this mess, feeling that leaders of the United States have left them with a mess, that the country's in terrible shape, and so they're just going to party while they can. Marijuana's legal most places, and just kind of enjoy. Maybe we'll get some great novels out of it, hoping for Hemingway in your generation, probably writing a novel by tweets. But that would be okay. Maybe an Instagram novel, that would be good. But we wouldn't see a big policy imprint from millennials in that scenario. Another possibility is that millennials are more like the greatest generation that came out of the Great Depression and World War II, who said, we're tired of isms. We saw fascism and communism make a mess of Europe. We don't want to hear about isms. And they just hew to the center. And all they want is centrist politics. The parties offered Tweedledee and Tweedledum kind of agendas, and everything was about, let's get results. Let's pull together. People who kind of tried to break up that consensus were quickly shunned because all the public wanted was the middle. And those were great times. And I know quite a few of my students, that kind of frustration turning into pragmatism and a disdain for all of these debates that we've been having on Rush Limbaugh and all the other channels. Is kind of strong. So I'm hopeful that in 2024 and even after 2022, we'll start to see the emergence of that new politics. But until then, I'm afraid it's going to be painful for all of us.
Tony, you want to bring us another question?
All right, thank you for that answer. We've received a few questions in regard to the US politics with China, specifically in big tech and the relationship. Would you have any thoughts on how this would differ between the previous or almost over Trump administration and the Biden administration?
I'd be happy to say something. Maybe Hugh, though, is a better answer on this one. His global perspective is excellent.
Go first, and I'll follow.
Okay. So the thing that I would start with is that the consensus that the peaceful rise strategy with China has not produced the results we had all hoped for is very strong in both political parties. And for the older leadership, it's almost like a Cold War reflex, a feeling that we now have to contain China, we have to focus on various aspects of the China relationship. And I suspect the hostility that characterizes the relationship now will continue. I had a hope briefly that we might see Canada's Ottawa group succeed in starting a new WTO round where we could bring the trade fight at least within bounds. But I don't think that will be possible now, unfortunately, because we're going to run out of trade promotion authority. And even if we do sign on to TPP, I think that the Biden administration will see that as part of a response to China, which is how it was originally proposed by Obama. And so this will only increase China's feeling of encirclement, which I think is unfortunate. Let me add to that a little bit more depressing news, and then I'll have one positive bit, just a little one for Canada. I also think that we're going to see a shift under Biden in the way in which we fight. I don't think Trump's trade and phase one deals and all his tariffs, I don't think that'll be Biden's way. Where I think Biden will be more likely to act is on Chinese human rights violations. I think we're going to see an era of sanctions rather than punitive tariffs, which may amount to the same thing, but they're at least a little bit more targeted at individuals, and they allow China the idea that they can still participate in exports and they can still grow. So we're not trying to deny China's growth, we're just trying to target bad actors. That could be as a result of Chinese action in Hong Kong. It could be as a result of Chinese actions in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs, both of which are issues that have deep support among Democrats and among Republicans. But a third area that I think a lot of us are starting to worry about has to do with Tibet. This is all sort of rumors, but the Dalai Lama has not been well, and we expect that when he passes, China will have its own Panchen Lama that it will try to put forward. It's strange. I don't know whether to blame the Beatles or why, but Tibet is a huge issue with a lot of politicians on both the Republican and Democratic side. And so I think that the playing out of that would also trigger sanctions. And sanctions can be targeted. That's the upside, but I think that will sour some of our relations with China. I promised some good news, and this picks up on something that Hugh said. I think that the Biden administration may change its attitude with regard to Meng Wanzhou and her arrest. Remember that the warrant that the U.S. served was on the basis that she conspired to violate Iran sanctions and operate in Iran in contravention of sanctions. Biden didn't believe in the reimposition of those sanctions. And if he's looking for a gesture to make to China to start a new era on a positive footnote, he could easily say, even to the hawks in his party, look, we've made our point. Let's send Meng Wanzhou home. Let's take the pressure off the Canadians. I think it's not automatic, but very important that at the same time he makes sure that the Chinese return the two Michaels at the same time. And it's not automatic. I could see him doing it for the gesture and then missing this. So I've been telling the embassy here in Washington, you've got to make sure there's a linkage there. But with the two Michaels return, maybe an easing in some of the trade tensions, I think there's potential for an improvement in that very narrow space. And who knows, maybe that goodwill would lead us to someplace better. But my suspicion is that as he tries to make relations better with China, the Hunter Biden laptop and all the charges that his son was involved in corrupt dealings in China will make him extra cautious not to be too soft on China for fear that these issues will be inflamed by Trump. So anyway, I'm mostly pessimistic, but there's one ray of hope. I promised you one. Hugh, you better cheer them up now.
I absolutely agree with everything you said about how things are likely to unfold with China. I did notice in the presidential debates that there was not that much daylight between Trump and Biden on China. Biden wasn't using terms like China virus, but he was very critical of China. And he's called President Xi a thug, which is sort of strong language in diplomatic terms. So I agree with you completely. I think this is partly determined by a structural situation of China's rise. For people paying attention to military issues, China has been investing enormous amounts of money in a new generation of weapons, nuclear weapons and other kinds of weapons, increasing the size of its navy. People are concerned about what China might be planning in the oceans around its territory in terms of grabbing stuff. And it's been behaving quite aggressively in Asia in terms of insisting that other countries shouldn't tolerate criticism of the Chinese regime at their universities and stuff like that, even in Australia. So I don't think we're in for an easy ride with China. There is a suggestion among many people in the nuclear weapons community that it's time to draw China into multilateral arms control negotiations. Their nuclear stockpile at just a few hundred nuclear weapons is much smaller than that of the US and that of Russia. But there's increasing talk that it's time to sort of socialize China into the community of countries that regulate their stockpiles through arms control treaties and exchange technical information with each other and have protracted discourse between their experts and their nuclear weapons complexes. So we may see some of that. If I could just say one thing to go back a question in response to what Christopher was saying about potential gridlock in Washington. I agree. If you look at it in terms of politics at the top, the institutions in Washington, gridlock does look like the most likely outcome. But America is more than just Washington, DC. And one thing that concerns me is that if you have 4 years of stasis, society out at the grassroots, you may see an explosion of some kind. I mean, the pandemic and police violence, especially against minorities, has already unleashed enormous unrest. You've seen a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan. You've seen people showing up at state houses with semi-automatic weapons in protests. You've seen massive Black Lives Matter protests. The new generation is clearly predisposed to protest. So you have people heavily armed out there with very strong feelings. I don't know whether to be more afraid of people in Washington getting something done that therefore annoys one group of people and they take to violence, or not getting anything done and people being so frustrated that violence of some kind breaks out. But I am concerned that stasis may be a recipe for more unrest out in the rest of America.
Can I just follow up on that very briefly? Would that be all right? So two things I want to add to that, because I think I agree with Hugh as well. One thing I would say is, for those of you who remember the early George W. Bush administration right before 9/11, one of the first things that happened during his administration, even though he was himself committed to peaceful rise, was the pushing down of a U.S. reconnaissance plane. We call it the EP-3 incident down on Hainan Island, with the taking of almost 20 U.S. servicemen as hostages. That was one of the tensest moments, and I don't believe it was driven by a Beijing decision, but by an over-aggressive military action that took a while to resolve. And so when he said early on that you never know, like there are unexpected things that can drive foreign policy, I think it's a mistake to view China as a monolith, that everything is very well organized. It, I think, has more characteristics of fragmented authoritarianism, to use a political sciencey term. And so there can be surprises. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, which has come up a little bit, but I think we should be cognizant of, we're in the middle of the COVID crisis, and we know already that it's hurt both of our economies, but also economies worldwide. And I think as we move out, hopefully with vaccines, and we're able to put as much of the pandemic behind us as we can, the work of recovering the economy will begin. For many countries other than developed countries, we're looking at severe shortcomings in their transportation infrastructure, their environmental infrastructure, their health infrastructure, their education infrastructure. And they have been coping as best they can during this period, while at the same time the US has been taking a much more protectionist attitude towards trade. So export-led growth has not been as much of an option for them. There was a report from the IMF 2 weeks ago that said that about 70% of their reserve capacity for stabilizing economies was now committed to Argentina, a country which has defaulted on its debts 9 times and probably will default again when all this settles. So we face a crisis in which many of the formerly emerging markets, many countries have lost a decade of growth or more just in this last year. Many of these countries are going to be looking for financing to climb back out. I mean, we can go back to normal by just voting Trump out, or partly, but for them, it's going to be very expensive. In the past, I would have said, well, the Americans will open their wallet and put some money into the IMF and the World Bank and will recapitalize the institutions to meet this growing need, or that the Europeans and the Americans will agree to do that. I look now and I see, even in a Biden administration, a difficulty getting this kind of Congress, the 117th, to make those big commitments, especially while President Biden's promised another $2 trillion for COVID relief. We spent $2 trillion in the last year. So it's going to be a lot. And Canada's budget's not in great shape either. If the West doesn't work with those institutions to try to help countries recover, China will. And China's financing will be with strings attached. We know how they've approached the Belt and Road, but it has the potential to shift great power competition in China's favor. If you're Peru, if you're Bolivia, if you're trying to get back on your feet, you may prefer American money or Western money, but if the only money on offer is China's, how would you not find their leadership appealing? And for issues like recognition of Taiwan and a range of other issues, I think China would have the ability to attach its own conditionality, just as the IMF used to attach Washington consensus conditionality. So we're facing a real challenge there, and I'm again depressing you all, but I think that's one where maybe Canada as a middle power, kind of trying to rally some countries to take this seriously and try to make sure there's a decent response from Western countries to the poorer countries of the world, is an area where you could make a historic contribution. But I hate to put all that on you, just to say.
I think we'll have to look very carefully at the clock now. So we're out of question time, I think, Tatiana, sorry. So it just remains for me to offer thanks, which is what I would normally do if I wasn't moderating. I just offer some thanks on behalf of CSTI. So I want to thank our panelists, first of all, of course, and the partners to put this together. So the School of Public Policy and Governance, Global Affairs, Political Science, and the Canadian International Council Vancouver branch. Thank you also to our staff and volunteers, so to Rebecca, Catalina, Tatiana, Lindsay, Tina, Joelle, and Paige, Brent at Political Science. And so, and the last thing I have to ask is that you join us for the last event in this series on the US election on November 19th, where we'll try to sum up all the remaining threads of the election, and we may have even a concession by that point, but I can't promise anything so strong as that. So thank you all for your attendance today, and we hope to see you on Thursday next week. Thanks again to the panelists, and thank everyone. Bye bye.
Yep, thank you.